shark biologist. What? I'm going to care for the degree? I don't really care about that. I don't know degrees anymore. We're at the point now where nothing matters more than what it is. Okay, why are you washing yourself with non-bacterial soap?
Achoo! Sneezing is okay, don't cough.
It's my professor.
All right.
So if here's the deal. If you want to, you should mute, and you should probably mute your video. But if you want to ask a question, unmute and unmute your video, and everyone will be able to see you.
It's something new. Okay, I don't have my video.
Just messing around here, getting this thing to work. Okay. Let me try sharing this screen, and let's see that one. Okay, what do you guys see? Somebody tell me.
We see your screen, Dr. McDonald.
Okay, great. Can you see me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
All right, good enough. Okay, let me go back to the beginning. We're almost ready to start, but let me wait a little. Let me get PowerPoint. There we go. I have to arrange all my windows. Okay, I think I got it. So there's a, let me close the door so we don't have. Okay, hang on one second. I got to talk to somebody. Hey, Daniel.
Oh, hey. You want to try cutting some of that stuff?
I do. I'm teaching class right now, but here's the cloth.
Yeah, give me the cloth. I can go do some testing.
Okay, so the inner cloth is this stuff. That's the inner cloth, and then the outer cloth is this. And I think she had all of the patterns cut for the women's sizes.
Okay.
So priority is men's sizes right now, but you might try both of them just to make sure that it works.
All right.
Okay, buddy, thanks a lot.
No problem. See you.
So I have an initiative underway where I went to a local seamstress and got a pattern online that showed how to make homemade face masks. And so I gave her the money to get going, and wanted her to make, like a couple hundred, men's sizes and women's sizes, because we can use them in the community here. And so she got started, but it turns out it's really labor intensive to cut the patterns. So I talked to Daniel Dominguez here in the department, and he's going over to the Innovation Hub on campus, and we're going to see if we can't use the laser cutter to cut out the patterns automatically, which would really speed everything up. So hopefully we can crank out some masks, because apparently that's a big shortage, is the supply of masks. All right, well, we're almost ready to start, and I want to just say, at the outset, I'm really grateful for you all showing up and hanging in there, supporting each other, supporting the whole class with your presence, and with, continuing to be interested and committed.
Oh, he's doing, my first teacher didn't have the cam on.
Yeah? Well, do you like it with the cam on?
I do.
Okay.
Cam on.
All right, well, good. All right, well, I'll do that, and hopefully that won't be too distracting. And you can see the slide, and then you can also, I guess, see, I'm not entirely sure what you all see, but I see my face and then a whole list of, the people who are participating. And looks like I got quite a few online here. I can't tell how many. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So the guideline is that you should mute your video and mute your audio. But if you want to ask a question, unmute your video and unmute your audio, and then everyone will be able to hear your question and see see you. Or you don't have to unmute your video if you prefer not to, but that way you can ask questions. Okay, so what I want to do this lecture is to go over the material that originally would have been scheduled for this time. This is material taken based on what's in Garrison Chapter 16, which is discussing marine communities. Now, last week, or I guess before spring break rather, on the last Thursday of class, I didn't have an in-class presentation, and because all that was canceled. And I went ahead and recorded a version of the lecture with an audio overlay on each slide. The problem with that method is that the file ends up being gigantic, and it was really kind of awkward. So that material is online. I did get it up there, and you can download it and listen to it. And there is going to be a reading quiz over that. So that material is present, but this is, I think, a better way to do this. Oh, you know what I need to do? I need to record. Let's see. How do I do that? I'm trying to figure out how to make sure I record this.
It says it's recording.
Says it's recording? Okay. Okay, yeah, I see it. Stop. Okay, pause recording. All right, great. All right, so we are recording. All right, so so we'll get to that material in a second here, but first I wanted to go over, how we have to revise this course to adapt to the changing circumstances and to try to keep everybody on step. So this is the revised course outline. So all the lectures will be presented as we're doing here via Zoom, and they'll be presented 12:30 to 1:45, Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were the regularly scheduled class periods. And this is per the guidelines that come down from the president of the university, that we should continue to hold classes at the regularly scheduled times, except via Zoom. So that's what I'm going to do. But I'm also recording these lectures, and the recording will be an MPEG-4 file, and I'll upload that to a YouTube channel that I have. So you'll be able to view this later, or if for some reason you can't get online during the class period, you'll be able to join later and watch the video. And I'm going to make up a new quiz, and you'll see there's a revision of how we're allocating points and what the assignments are going to be for the rest of the semester. So there'll be a 10-point quiz over the lecture material, and that'll be posted on Canvas, and you can do that. I guess I'll give you 48 hours to get that done. And that's just to make sure everybody stays current. Now, the points and the questions will hopefully be, pretty easy. I'm not going to try to challenge you too much, but I do want to verify that people have looked at the material, that they've learned the material, and are ready to go ahead. So I also will upload the lecture notes slides as we've done before, and so the lecture notes with the 3 slide thumbnails with the notes are online now, and I'll try to get them up a little bit sooner so that you can take notes as we went, if you like. And I'm going to have to revise what the assignments are, just because we can't keep functioning the way we have. There are going to be 3 more team homeworks that are going to be based on the readings or on material in the slides. And so I'll put those up, and the teams will be responsible for answering these questions as before. I'm not sure if I'll continue.
When will the lecture quizzes be due?
The lecture quizzes will be due 48 hours after the lecture. So I'll prepare the lecture questions after I finish the lecture. So I make sure that I covered that material, and then I'll post those onto Canvas. Then I'll give you 48 hours from the time that they're posted to get them handed in.
Who's that talking?
My teacher.
Oh. All right, well, I'll let you. Are you on class right now or something?
Yeah, but I don't even pay attention anyway.
Okay. All right, so make sure you keep muted unless you're asking a question. All right, so that's the basic revision of the class, some of the lecture material. I've also revised the team projects. Now, I sent around an announcement, but after sending an announcement, I thought a little bit more about how I need to do this. But the basic idea is that I'm going to revise the team project.
I don't know, but it will by next year.
I just don't see how we can ask people to, somebody needs to mute their mic, please.
You're going to have to figure out something to do for work.
Well, nothing is open.
Well,
Make sure you have the little mic muted.
Do you think that extended day for summer is going to be a thing?
Well, I don't know, man. This is
think
all
so.
new for everybody, so.
I think it will be.
Okay, hey, everybody check right now and make sure that you're muted.
It needs to be open.
Well, you know about your Bright Future Scholarship money better than I do and what the guidelines.
Hey, Dr. McDonald,
Yeah,
you can mute Cole Brooks,
About my
I think, who is not muted.
okay. Oh, Brooks.
Yeah, but then I don't know what I'm going to do with my.
Okay, good
There you
assignment.
go.
Got it. Thanks a lot. All right, I will keep this here. Okay, so the team projects are revised, and I'm not going to have you do a written report because I just think that's too burdensome to have people trying to write remotely. But instead, you're going to have to prepare an extended abstract. So that's like a, we'll say a 750-word outline or abstract of what you found and what you all thought. So everybody can contribute to that. And I will, and then in addition, you need a properly formatted bibliography of sources. And there's a minimum of 10 peer-reviewed sources and 5 popular press or web sources. I'd like to see a lot more than that, but that's the minimum. And your major focus of the team project will be preparing and then delivering a 20-minute power presentation, which we'll do during the last class periods. The team presentations will be done via Zoom, and just like the lectures that I'm giving, I'll record those Zoom presentations, and we'll have a YouTube upload for that. And in addition, I'd like each team to prepare 5 multiple choice or true-false questions based on the material in their presentation, and that'll be, they'll send those to me, and I'll upload them for the class to answer on Canvas. And obviously, each team will know the answers to their questions, but overall, everyone will have to tune in to answer those. So that's an individual requirement from the teams. So that everybody has to individually answer the 5 multiple choice questions that each team prepares over their presentation. So here is a revised course plan showing the points for assignments. And this is the assignment is in the left-hand column, and what was asked for by the old syllabus is in the middle left column. What we've done so far is in the middle right column, and then what we have to be completed is in the the right-hand column. So you can see that I've reduced, if you look down in the bottom here, I've reduced the total number of points from 950 to 890 points. So what remains are 3 reading quizzes. Oh, I guess I got this wrong. The 3 reading quizzes. So the reading quizzes are the same as the team homeworks. So that's going to be based on a revised total of 860 points, not 890 points. Sorry, I got confused there. The team project, instead of being worth 350 points, that'll be worth 200 points total. So you've already earned 75. You've already earned 75 points, and there are 200 points remaining to be earned. The take-home final will be worth 100 points, but the in-class final, of course, has been canceled. And then these lecture quizzes, which are the 10-point quizzes that all come up, they'll be worth a total of 100 points. So all the assignments combined will add up to 860 points, not 890 as it shows in this slide, and I'll fix that. And then this is the way that I'm going to allocate grades. I've sort of really opened up the number of points allowed for different grades. So you can see that from 86 to 100 points, you'll get an A. From 71 to 85 points, you get a B. 56 to 70 points gets a C. And D is anything less than 56 points. I'm not going to flunk anybody who's still breathing at the end of this class. So let me take a moment there. Are there any questions over this? And if you'd like me to go back to a slide, let me know. So questions, please. Brandon, you're recognized.
Hey,
Brandon, go ahead.
I just want to ask, so is it just the plain letter grade as in A, B, C, D, or A minus, A plus, B minus, B plus, or are we just straight up doing letter grades?
You know, I didn't think about pluses and minuses. I can do that. So I can, yeah, I haven't thought about how to allocate that, but I guess I can do that. I guess I can make B minus. I guess I won't do, you know what, I'm not going to do B minus or C minus or D minus. But if you get in the final 5 points of each category, I'll give you a plus, not for an A, of course, because there is no A plus.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Sure. So no A minus, no B minus, no C minus, but in the top 5 points for each category, you get a plus. So you can get a B plus or a C plus.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions about the revised course plan?
yes, Dr. McDonald. So in the email you sent us earlier, you said that we had a true or false, we have to add a true or false part to our presentations.
Yes.
So you expect us to see other people's presentations and then also answer these questions on Canvas?
That's correct. Yeah. So I guess I should clarify that. Each team should prepare in advance 5 multiple choice or true false questions, send them to me, and then what I will do is after the presentation, so there'll be 3 team presentations per lecture, and after the 3 team presentations, I will upload, there'll be an upload of multiple choice questions, okay? So, and there won't be any other online questions to answer after during the final class periods when we have team presentations. So there's going to be 5 class periods when we have team presentations, and each of those class periods, there'll be 15 points that you have to get by answering the Canvas questions.
All right, thank you.
Okay? So yeah, so ahead of time you have to do that. Oh, and I've kind of messed this up. I guess I'll have to revise the schedule and think about this, but there is still milestone 3 that's due. So what I'd like you to do is to have that milestone 3 due on the regular date, and I will have a Zoom meeting. I think I said this in the Canvas announcement I sent out. I'll go ahead and have a Zoom meeting with each team to go over your presentation to help you with any questions that you have.
Right.
Okay? So, and I do apologize if there's sort of roughness and uncertainty, because this is kind of hard to figure out how to do all this exactly, but we'll get through it, and you know, that's how we got to roll from here on out. Okay, any other questions about grades or how we're going to do this, or what kind of material we're going to cover?
Dr. McDonald,
Yeah.
can you review the format for the lecture quizzes?
Okay, well, the lecture quizzes will be the same as the homework quizzes that the team homework quizzes that I've been giving out.
Okay.
So there'll be 10 questions, which I will make up, and I'll make them up after the lecture to make sure that I've covered that material. And then they'll be on Canvas, you know, and there'll be choices, and you just answer and click, and then you get your points.
And what is the due date for that, as far as like if we have a lecture, how soon do we need to complete that?
Okay, so after I finish this lecture, I'll make up the questions and I'll put that on Canvas, and that'll be 48 hours after the quiz goes up on Canvas that you have to answer it.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, other questions? All right, sounds good. So here's another thing. If any student has any difficulty, if there's, you know, I'll send an announcement out there. You know, it looks like I've got about 71 or 72 participants, which is not the full class. So I'm a little concerned that some people may not have online access or other issues like that. So if anybody's in that situation, or their situation changes where they're not going to have online access, get a hold of me and we'll try to work something out to where we can, you know, get you through the class. Okay? All right, any other questions or concerns? And then we'll start with the regular lecture material. Okay, great. All right, so this is a lecture, and we're talking about communities. Now, in the last, in the presentation that I gave, or the lecture that I put online, we talked about different aspects of marine organisms. And in particular, I talked about the sort of primary production, secondary production, and consumers. And I hope everybody was able to follow along with that important point about the difference between terrestrial ecosystems and marine ecosystems in terms of primary production. This is kind of a key point, and this is one of the things that, you know, that really outlines, really defines what a marine community is, and that's the fact that the primary production on land, the standing stock biomass, or the total biomass of primary producers, always greatly exceeds the biomass of the consumers and the predators, primary consumers and the predators, because plant material on land comprises vascular plants, multicellular plants with, in many cases, large amounts of biomass. Whereas in the ocean, the biomass is, or the primary production is entirely microbial, well, almost entirely microbial if we don't count the macroalgae. And this.
Alrighty, where are we heading?
And that primary production. So that means that there's very rapid
I follow ye.
turnover of the, somebody is not muted. That means that there's very rapid turnover of the primary production. Okay, somebody is talking there. Okay, so that's a key feature of the marine system. And an overview of this material is that the living organisms within any ecosystem comprise a community. So we think about an ecosystem as having living components and non-living components and energetic throughput. But if we talk about just the living organisms, they together comprise a community, and the community consists of primary producers, primary consumers, and then predators at different levels, and then finally decomposers. But if we take away, so the community of living marine organisms is the living component of the ecosystem, minus the energy throughput and the non-living components. And these communities live, and each organism within the community lives within a habitat. So the habitat is formed partly by the non-living components. They, in the case of the ocean, where they find themselves, where the organisms situate themselves in the water column, or for organisms that live in the benthic layer, where they, how they make burrows or seek, find other places to exist. And together, the place where each individual can live is what's called a niche. So a niche is the sort of the multidimensional resources that define how a species can survive and persist over multiple generations. So, and within this niche is constrained by the stresses that the environment put on individual species, and for the species to be able to tolerate a range of these stresses. Individual species or different species compete, and they compete for resources. And the upshot of this competition is the development of different species. So some organisms specialize on one type of prey or one type of grazing organism, and they compete with other organisms, and the successful adaptation to being able to obtain some component of this is what defines, part of what defines their niche. So, and then within a community, each population has a carrying capacity. And that is, the carrying capacity is the number of individuals that can persist from generation to generation. And the changes that occur within communities, including disturbance, succession, and stability, are dynamic processes that shape the way the community can exist over time. Some examples of marine communities would include a rocky intertidal zone. So this is a rocky area on the shoreline of a coast, and intertidal means that the habitat is inundated at high tide and dry, subaqueous, exposed to air during low tides. Another example would be a coral reef. This is also a coastal community, but typically coral reefs are underwater most of the time. I guess some coral reefs, there may be some exposure of corals at low tide, but typically coral reefs are entirely inundated. Pelagic ecosystem comprises the vast majority of the ocean volume. So pelagic, of course, means free floating within or free moving within the marine environment. So the pelagic community can include organisms that mostly live in the upper portion of the water column, or some that live in the midwater, or many that migrate up and down between these two within the water column. Another example of marine community are benthic communities, and these are communities of organisms that live on the sea floor. Beach, kelp forests, these are other examples of marine communities, each with a set of primary producers, consumers, predators, and decomposers. So this is a general overview of what we're trying to look at when we think about marine communities.
I have a
So,
question about the rocky intertidal and coral reefs.
Sure, go ahead. Question about rocky intertidal and coastal. Can you identify yourself, please?
Raquel
Okay,
Pilara.
Raquel.
Can you, I think I misheard you, but I thought you were saying that coral reefs are an example of rocky intertidal, or are they just very similar? Because you're saying that the rocky intertidal marine communities are exposed to air during low tides, and that coral reefs can be exposed to air during low tides as well. Like, what's the biggest difference between them?
Well, the rocky intertidal, you know, the entire tidal range comprises the rocky intertidal. For a coral reef, it's the only portion of the coral reef is the uppermost portion of the coral reef range that's exposed. So at low tide on a coastal coral reef, you may see the tops of the corals just sticking out of the water or just immediately under the surface. But if corals are completely exposed to air, they're completely dried out without any waves keeping them moist, most corals will die back. And you know, within a rocky intertidal zone, for example, you'll see anemones, which are closely related to corals, and the anemones have to be kept moist. So anemones will thrive in a tide pool. So the slide at the beginning of this is actually a picture of an anemone in a tide pool, and all of these anemones are sort of either open or curled up to sort of protect themselves. And this is in a little pool of water that's within the rocky zone. So, you know, when corals are exposed, they have to do the same thing. They have to withdraw their tentacles and pull them up and protect themselves. And if they completely dry out for any period of time, that's fatal for them. So your question is very good because it gets to this question of range. So, you know, organisms can tolerate a range of conditions, and corals can tolerate a certain level of exposure to air, but they can't completely dry out. So that defines the upper limit of coral communities. And, you know, continuing with this idea, you know, it's a really excellent question because it draws out this, you know, if you think about what a coral community needs, for corals that have zooxanthellae that are photosynthesizing, the lower end of their range is going to be defined by the availability of light to drive photosynthesis. So the coral reef goes from, you know, depths of, you know, 100 to 150 meters when there's just barely enough light to support photosynthesis, all the way up to the surface, but, you know, deep enough so that they're never completely dried out. Okay?
Okay, thanks.
So, you know, we say that no species, and I think I've made this point previously, no species can exist without an ecosystem. There has to be a system of non-living components, of energy, and of living other living organisms to allow a species to exist. And so a group of species living together is called a community, which is a human term with ecological meaning. Within a biological community, a marine community no exception, each species performs a distinct function. And of course, the function that we talk about most are primary producers. Would somebody tell me if when I move the cursor across the screen, do you see that?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Okay, good. It's good to know. Okay, so primary producers are the basis of the food chain. Of course, they're using light energy, or in some cases, chemical energy, to make new organic carbon, which then moves through the food chain. Other examples are grazers, and so these are organisms that are eating the products of the primary producers. And primary producers numerically outnumber grazers in a marine community, but in terms of the biomass is only a fraction. And in fact, as you go up in the marine food chain, the biomass tends to increase. So if we think about grazers, they tend to be smaller fish or organisms in a marine community, whereas predators are often very large. And so this is a difference between marine communities and terrestrial communities. Think about that. You know, wolves and lions tend to be a lot smaller than, and other predators tend to be smaller than their prey. Whereas in the marine community, the top predators tend to be much larger than their prey. And then finally, there are decomposers, and these organisms perform a very important function of breaking things down. Decomposers are typically microbial, although there are multicellular organisms that can facilitate decomposition. And finally, there are parasites, which don't do anybody any good, but they're definitely a component of communities, and they tend to create stress on marine organisms. Okay, so you know, within a community, there are many different functions which are performed by different classes of organisms, and this is an example here of the different classes, generally speaking. So we talked about habitat, and so the habitat is the location within which a species can survive. Okay, and that's what the question earlier, you know, brought that out as I explained, you know, the range of the habitat of corals. So the range that I described of corals living from the greatest depth at which there's still available light for photosynthesis, all the way up to the top of the water column at low tide, that's the habitat for all coral reefs combined. But within that range, different species will have a particular sub-ranges where they are best adapted. So some corals like to be up where there's abundant light, and they can tolerate, you know, occasional exposure to air. Other corals are adapted to using different ranges of light, and they like to live deeper into in the water. So you know, there's a location within the species which can survive, and part of that location includes the range of stresses that species are likely to encounter. And you know, this range, you know, we've talked about this range in terms of position in the water, but there's also a vast range of geographic distance within which different conditions will be encountered. And if we consider, for example, the humpback whale, which has a very, very broad range, it feeds in the Arctic. The productivity in the Arctic is high enough to support the very large biomass that humpback whales obtain. But in order to reproduce, it has to breed and give birth in the tropics. Warmer water is necessary to help the offspring survive. So the total range of the humpback whale is from the Arctic, and particularly the Arctic where there's high productivity overall of the fish and other organisms that it eats. Humpback whales don't feed on plankton per se, but they eat small fish like herring and other small fish. So they have to have those in large abundance to support their biomass. And they also need these, the tropical temperatures in order to persist generation over generation. So in the case of the humpback whale and other whales that have this broad range, if any portion of this range becomes no longer available, or the conditions change and don't support the needs of the species, that can put a stress on the species across its entire range. So for example, one of the issues in the Arctic right now for many whale species is that the Arctic is warming and seems to be becoming less productive of the kinds of foods which have, through ecological history, supported whales. And so whales, not just humpback whales, but other whales, are under stress because conditions have changed in a part of their range. So right whales, for example, which are plankton feeding whales, are now at the edge of extinction because their habitat is no longer producing the same amount of plankton, and also human activity is impinging, boat traffic and so forth tends to harm these right whales. So right whales, although their range still exists, it's become stressful in critical portions, and so that species is at risk. So in most communities, there are some organisms that create habitats for others. And this example here, this shows, this is an interesting kind of picture. This is this picture on the right here is a mussel shell, shows a mussel shell, and there's a little gastropod, and which is crawling across the shell. Now what this gastropod does, this little snail, is it has radula and teeth, and it can scrape algae and other detrital products off the surface of the shell. And so mussel beds tend to have, sometimes hundreds or thousands of these tinier gastropods that are living on the habitat created by the bed of mussels. And then here's a shrimp, and this shrimp makes a living by going around and nipping off little portions of it also browses, this particular shrimp, this particular shrimp also browses bacteria and detrital material. And then within this same community, there are other crabs that make a living by attacking the gastropods and sometimes even attacking the mussels themselves. So this is an example of when you start concentrating one type of species, others come in and take advantage of the habitat that species creates. And I'm sure you can think of other examples of how that works. So organisms, they alter the physical environment just by their presence, and they can also alter the chemical and even the thermal properties of the environment. And this modifies the habitat of other organisms. So this is a way in which the community works together. And we started about talking about the relationship between the primary producers and the secondary producers, but this is a relationship between organisms which may have different levels in the food chain that create habitat within their communities just by their presence. So here's an example of modification of a habitat. Again, this is a picture taken from the rocky intertidal zone, and I choose this because you have such a wide range. Now you can see that there are a series of depressions here, and these depressions are actually formed by anemones, which wear away the rock. And so they have little radula, little teeth-like things, and they also excrete acids, and they're able to dig these burrows into this carbonate rock. And so each one of these burrows was formed, probably over multiple individuals, and becomes a habitat for these anemones. But other organisms can also take advantage of the burrows that are formed. So other species can come in. This is a coralline algae. that's occupying, and there might be mussels. Here are limpets that are moving across the habitat, and they might take advantage. So you can see here, how the activity of one organism is altering the physical environment, and that alteration of the physical environment is something that propagates through the community and is part of the community if they've changed the physical environment. So that change is permanent, and we can think of many examples of that. Woodpeckers that are pecking holes in trees that are then occupied by squirrels. So there are many, many examples of this physical alteration, and you can see them very clearly in these intertidal examples. So this concept that we introduced, the concept of a niche, we define a niche as a multidimensional description of how a species can survive. And every species has a unique niche. So species and niches are, not interchangeable, but they're related. They're dependent on each other. And, it's the exact linkage and the exact definition of what the niche is and what the requirements of the species are may not always be clear. And there are many, many species where we don't completely understand what they need, what their niche is. And sometimes we don't understand what their niche is until we've removed that niche in some way, by human impact, and the species goes extinct. So let's consider this. What does a species eat? Is it a carnivore or an herbivore? How does it obtain food? What environmental tolerances does it have? What eats it? What does it have to hide from? And the set of answers, what does it need to reproduce? What are our special adaptations? What are other needs that it has for nutrients or other things? And the set of answers to these sorts of questions is unique for each species, and you can see how that works. Now, this is important, this understanding of the species. So when you have a fully stable community, what we call a climax community, that means that all the niches tend to be filled, and there are species that are specialized for the different available niches. But let's consider a circumstance in which there are open niches. And we've talked about this before when we talked about Darwin's finches. So if you have an island, suppose an island forms because a volcano erupts. And so here's brand new land that comes up in the middle of the ocean. Well, the niches, the potential niches, may not have, or probably will not have, species to fill them. So, there are no, when it first forms, there are no species, and the species have to arrive by the process of colonization. So in the case of the Galapagos Islands, the new islands opened up and there were no bird species. So when the species, one type of bird, in the case of the famous case of the Galapagos Islands, finches, one species of finch arrived, and then that species, because it had many different ways to make a living, radiated and split into many other subspecies. Each of these subspecies specialized for some aspect of the environment that allowed it to survive. So this question of niche is absolutely fundamental to evolution and to understanding of how species work. Also because of community effects, the occurrence of a species or a niche often produces other niches and other species. In the case, and I showed you the example of this, in the case of the mussels that had little gastropods that were specialized for browsing material off the surface of the mussel shells. So, as the community develops, the complexity increases as niches are created. Okay, so if you think about this new browser that is now living on the mussel shell, well, some predator might come along that's specialized for eating those browsers. Okay, so you see how this works. The other thing that we have to understand is that every every community, every niche comes with biological and physical stresses and limitations. Talked about coral reefs and intertidal zones, and those things are the sort of create the boundary conditions within which a community or can exist, or within a community within which a particular species can survive. So different organisms have different tolerances for specific factors. And an organism may be broadly adapted to different conditions, or it may be narrowly focused. And so we can describe these sort of formally and scientifically with the prefixes steno and uri. So a steno means narrow, and it can be used to describe organisms that have a narrow range of tolerances. And an example of this would be stenohaline. You probably figure out what this means. Steno means narrow, and haline refers to salinity. So a stenohaline organism is one which tolerates a relatively narrow range of salinities. Uri is a prefix that means wide, and it describes organisms that have wide tolerances for specific factors. For example, eurythermal means an organism that can tolerate a wide range of temperatures. Now let's think about that. So if we have an organism on an intertidal zone, which is sometimes underwater and sometimes exposed at low tide, you would think, what would you think? Would it be stenothermal or eurythermal? Well, a little bit of thinking would suggest that, you know, when it's exposed to air and sunlight, the temperature is going to increase, and when the water comes back, the temperature is going to decrease, perhaps quite sharply. So an organism that lived in that particular niche would have to be eurythermal in its adaptations.
I have a question about the steno and uri
Yes.
tolerances. Does that relate at all to different kind of species, like the R and K species, and how different kinds of animals can be classified as an R species or a K species? Like, do these two things go with that? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for that. You know, R and K, you know, are terms of, you know, how widely and rapidly does it reproduce? So, you know, a K strategy is, you know, producing few offspring. R is wide. So, you know, I would think that one of the R strategy characteristics is to produce a wide range of offspring that may have different genetic tolerances. So there's a genetic range within any species, and some organisms will tolerate high temperatures or low temperatures. So if you're producing many organisms, each haplotype would then have could then have a different range of tolerances. So within that reproductive generation, there would be a good chance that it would, one or the other of the individuals reproduced, the offspring would have a chance of surviving. So it's not, I think so. Then that certainly plays a factor in R versus K reproduction, but that's not. It's a little bit different from this specific. This is a more general definition of how we describe ranges. Okay. Another thing to think about is distribution patterns. And distribution patterns are really a key factor. And if we can map distribution patterns and describe them statistically and in terms of with a good accuracy, the distribution pattern can tell us something about the niche of the organism, and also how it relates to other organisms in the community and other members of its species. So let's consider 3 different distribution patterns, and these should be pretty clear. A random distribution pattern would suggest that the distance from one individual to any other individual is a random function. In other words, if you take a given individual, the range from it to its nearest neighbor or its most distant neighbor is going to be a random function with a normal distribution or possibly some other statistical distribution pattern, but you would expect to see this random pattern. So, finding one organism is not going to tell you, where you're going to find another, or how far you have to go to find another individual. In a clumped pattern, species tend to occur together. They tend to bunch up together. And there can be a number of different reasons for this kind of clustering. In the example of mussel beds, the mussels have to tolerate, if mussels on a intertidal zone, they have to tolerate the wave energy coming in and hitting them. And so that's a real strain. They also have to tolerate drying out. So mussels tend to cluster together because they attach to each other with, they excrete what are called byssal threads. And these byssal threads are sort of like gluey little threads that stick on to other individuals. Each mussel has a little gland, an organ that generates byssal threads, and the threads can spread out, over a fairly large area. So a mussel bed, they're all sort of tied together with this array of byssus, and that allows them, that gives the overall mass of mussel bed the ability to withstand the huge pounding that waves can produce. So they need to be clustered and clumped together, and you would expect to find them clumped. There are other reasons for organisms clustering together. We often see on land, you can see trees that tend to form clusters, and that's a pretty common feature of live oak groups and other features, other tree species across the Florida landscape. So clumping, organisms that like to be together. A uniform distribution, where there's a sort of a pretty predictable range of distances from one species, from one individual in a species to the next, that tends to indicate competition. So, these species, this one is competing with that one, and, they can't get any closer to each other, or, the resources won't be there, or they'll physically attack, so that they try to distribute the availability of material. And so, forests, ecosystem forests, tend to produce a uniform spacing, between trees, having to do with the size of the tree canopy. So uniform, has to do with competition for typically has to do with competition for limited resources. And, if you go back to that picture that I showed, let's see, here, you could almost say that this is kind of a uniform pattern, rather than a clumped pattern. This may be a cluster, on a larger scale, but at a smaller scale, looks like this is kind of uniform, which would suggest that each individual has a specific range within which it's acquiring resources. And if it clusters together too closely, that may produce unsustainable competition. So each organism has got to have its own little burrow, and burrows can't overlap each other to too great a degree. Okay, so here's another way of describing this, tolerance, or presenting a general picture of this idea of tolerance and density. So ideally, you would expect species density to reach a maximum where where all the conditions are most favorable. So in this range here, in this idealized graph, we're suggesting that there's an optimal range of temperature for this particular species of fish. So it likes it between, some range of temperatures. And where those ranges, where that range is optimal, you find the greatest density of organisms. Now, as you move away from this, central optimum, the stress begins to develop. So, as it gets colder, fewer of these organisms can withstand, or fewer of these species can withstand this stress. And beyond, the range here, they can't tolerate it. Likewise, as temperature increases. So you could put any, environmental factor, or many environmental factors might, lie along this x-axis here. So you could think of salinity, availability of nutrients, availability of sunlight, any environmental factor, or many, many different environmental factors, can contribute to this optimal range and create stress or intolerance as the range is exceeded, either one end to the other.
Can I ask a quick question about the muscles again?
About the muscles?
Yeah, when you're saying that muscles attach together by the basal threads,
Yes.
for a reason like withstanding waves, is that the same with barnacles attaching onto like the sides of like in canals and all? Is that the same thing for barnacles?
Well, it's similar. I mean, barnacles do tend to cluster together, but they are clustered, by the optimality of their range. So a barnacle has a good substrate to attach to, and a good availability of food from, passing water. But the individual barnacles are not dependent on each other the same way that the mussels are. So the mussels are actually, in the case of mussels bound together on a rocky shore, they're actually depending on each other, and so the clustering allows more individuals to bind together and for offspring to survive within that cluster. Whereas the barnacles, I think, is an example of clustering because of an optimal range of conditions. So you think about, the barnacles have to be clustered onto a piling, because without that piling, there's no place for them to attach. And so that produces a clustering because of this range description. So if you had a rope or something that wasn't as easy to attach to, they might very well, have not be so dense in their clustering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so any factor, or many, many different factors, can be described along this x-axis here, and the y-axis is the number of individuals, or the success of individuals over time. So here's an illustration, and I've got pictures of this. I'll put them online, and to make this more available. This is an example of the rocky intertidal. So here's the high tide, and here's the low tide. Balinus are the mussels. These are the anemones, or the grazing organisms. And this is a competition. This is a zone of competition. Okay, so here's, so this is saying that mussels can exist across this whole range, and the forgetting the name of this organism. Sorry. These chitons can exist across this range, and within at the two margins, the two species are competing. As you get deeper, you get outside the range of Cathalmus, and these are barnacles. Excuse me. So these are barnacles, and these are mussels. And so the barnacles can live, can tolerate more exposure to water than the mussels can. So the mussels are excluded above a certain range, whereas the barnacles can't, live as deeply in the water, And so they're excluded below a certain range. So there's this competition there, and that makes the boundary between the two different species kind of fuzzy. So this is an example of competitive interaction, and that has the effect of reducing the range of both competitors. And so, we understand this because we can scientifically, experimentally, we could remove one species or another. So if we removed all the barnacles from this picture, the mussels would expand into the open range, and that can be done, and that's one of the sort of classic experiments that people do in the rocky intertidal. Here's another example of stress intolerance from a very, very different environment. And this is a hydrothermal vent zone, and this is a flange chimney or flange. So what's happening is, it's a little hard to see, but at the bottom of this picture, there's hydrothermal fluid coming out. This is at a depth of about 2,600 meters in the Juan de Fuca hydrothermal vent zone. And so if you took a thermometer and put it in right here, or a thermistor right here, you could record temperatures of in excess of 250 degrees Celsius. So this is extremely hot water that's coming out here. And then as you move further away, you still get temperatures, and there can still be sort of turbulent eddies that will bring the temperatures up fairly high. And then as you get further and further up, the temperature range decreases. So there are a couple of different species on this, living within this picture. So this is a mosaic. And the distance here is not that gigantic. These are little worms, and each of the worms, this is probably about 5 to 10 centimeters. And so each of these little calcareous tubes here is the home of a single worm. These are polychaetes called alvanellid polychaetes. So the way these alvanellid polychaetes make a living is they have tentacles, and the tentacles allow them to graze on bacteria, chemosynthetic bacteria. So there are abundant chemosynthetic bacteria that can tolerate the high temperatures, and can, by using chemosynthesis, they can use that chemical energy to produce biomass. So the primary producer in this ecosystem are these chemosynthetic bacteria. And there are other places where chemosynthetic bacteria live in this ecosystem, but these are the free-living ones. And so these alvanellid worms are clearly able to tolerate high temperatures, but not too high temperatures. And what they do is they extend from their tubes, and their tentacles will browse bacteria off the surface of the rock as long as the temperature is okay. But if there's within their tolerance range, but if there's a a turbulent eddy or something that sends a bundle of hot water, that can retreat inside their tubes to protect themselves. And so the environment for these organisms is kind of flickering between super, super hot, intolerably hot, and tolerably hot. And so these guys can live within that range. And it's kind of interesting because when they first discovered polychaetes, these alvanellid polychaetes, it was thought that that they were somehow able to survive temperatures in excess of 100 degrees, well, which shouldn't be the case. And in fact, it wasn't the case. So they didn't, the way they survive is they stick their heads out, they stick their tentacles on, these are literally the heads, and they stick them out and browse, but then they're able to pull themselves back and protect themselves from high temperatures if there's some kind of blast of hot water. So these are the alvanellid worms. And then further up, you have another species of polychaetes that are called paralvanellids that are, they're also able to tolerate high temperatures, but at a, not as high as the alvanellids. So alvanellids and paralvanellids are two species that have slightly different temperature ranges. And then you can also see tube worms. This is an example of a tube worm here. and it's a little difficult. So here's a tube worm that has its tentacle extended. And so this is an organ that's adapted not for browsing bacteria, but for taking up oxygen from the water. So this red color comes from a specialized hemoglobin that the tube worm has. And then you can also see, densely within this, some of these little gastropods, that make a living within the overall habitat created by a combination. So the fundamental rock here, the fundamental mineral substrate, is a polymetallic sulfide, which is precipitated from the hydrothermal vent fluid. So the hydrothermal vent fluid comes out, it precipitates this little ledge. The hot water is trapped under this little ledge. Every once in a while, it'll overflow and create super hot temperatures at the edge. Bacteria, are abundant on this surface, and then the different forms of worms are able to graze on the bacteria. And then there are also, crabs and some fish that are predators on the gastropods and the different worm species. Although this is a very stressful environment and predators tend to avoid it. So that's a niche that allows these organisms to exist. So adaptation to stress allows some species to live where similar species cannot. It reduces competition. And also adaptation to stressful conditions can also confer some protection from predators. So here's another example of environmental stress. This is again from the deep sea. These are pictures taken off the Florida escarpment. This is pictures that taken from the submarine Alvin. And during this particular dive of the submarine Alvin, the submarine started at the base of the escarpment at about 3,000 meters water depth, and then it went up the escarpment along the way. And what was striking about this dive was that most of the escarpment was unoccupied, despite the fact that there's lots of hard substrate. So typically in the deep ocean, it's muddy bottom, and where you have rocks and shipwrecks and hard substrates, corals and other sessile organisms will attach and make a living. But the stress in this environment, the stress in this environment came from the incredible levels of sedimentation. So there's lots of sediment coming off of the surface of coming down from the land and sinking through the water, and that stress is such that it makes it difficult for most species to survive. This is an example of an octocoral, and this is an octocoral that has this spiral pattern. It's quite striking. This is one of the few animals encountered in this environment. But one place within this were the underside of ledges. So some places there would be underside of ledges where there was a protection from the sediments. And you can see this sponge. This is a species of deep sea sponge. And the sponge is sort of, part of the sponge is being inundated by the sediments, and it's can't survive. But a portion of the sponge colony is able to make it, if it's protected. And so, where we would encounter, abundant life in this environment was on the underside of ledges and crevasses that were protected from this high rate of sedimentation. So that's another example, two examples from the deep sea of this kind of stress, environmental stress, and the way in which tolerance to that environmental stress or protection from those environmental stresses would create niches within which organisms could survive. Okay, so we've talked about animals living together in communities, and we've talked about predation and primary consumption, and we can codify all the different relationships between organisms if we think about species interactions. And that's what this table tries to show. Now this is, within each of these descriptors, you know, there are many different ranges, and it's sort of hard to define. It's kind of fuzzy, you know, how these things are defined. But if we look at what we can think about the interaction between one species and another species and broadly define it across according to these different categories. So an example of neutralism is where one species doesn't really have any effect on the other species. Okay, so it's neutral. There's no, it's not beneficial or harmful for the two species to co-occur within the same habitat, within the same area. You can also have a competitive interaction, and that the example of that was between the mussels and the mussels and the barnacles in that diagram that I showed you. So another example would be inhibition. And so inhibition is where B inhibits A. So somehow or another, B is creating conditions that make it difficult for A to survive. So this is, you know, B doesn't care whether or not A is there, or the presence of A has no direct effect on B because it's created conditions that inhibit the interaction of these two. Parasitism, you know, there's a parasite and a host. And so the parasite derives benefit, and the host, you know, suffers some loss. And, you know, the obvious example of parasitism that we all experience and are starting to experience more and more are mosquitoes. And, you know, they're parasites, a type of parasite that is parasitic on human beings. They get a little benefit every time they take some of our blood, and we don't like it every time. Of course, you know, mosquitoes in the range that we encounter them are tolerable, but parasites can be a big problem. One of the problems facing animals in changing conditions, warming conditions, is that parasites tend to be inhibited by cold weather, for example. So if it's warm all the time you know, in Canada, for example, raising temperatures mean that you know, the ticks and the fleas that attack moose and deer become much more plentiful. They're not wiped out the way they are by cold water temperatures. And so this is posing a major restriction on you know, those ungulates in that environment because of the changing conditions. Predation is similar to parasitism in that one species is eating another species. It's, you know, pretty easy to think of, you know, how that interaction is always positive in one direction and negative in another direction. Mutualism, both species benefit, and it's not exclusive. So species can create conditions that help each other out. So there's both sides are going. Symbiosis. So, but in mutualism, there's benefit, but it's not mandatory benefit. That's different from symbiosis. So animal organisms can live together and they can benefit from having the presence of the other species, but that presence is not required. In symbiosis, that there's a benefit, but both organisms need each other. And in the marine setting, an example of symbiosis is the relationship between bacteria, which are able to conduct chemosynthesis, or chemoautotrophy, and their hosts, like tube worms or mussels. And in this case, the symbionts, the bacterial species, are adapted to the condition that the host creates, and they really cannot or do not survive independently. Likewise, if the host loses all of its symbionts, it tends to die. So that's an example in the chemosynthetic organisms. The same sorts of symbiosis is very important for corals. So corals, reef-building corals have photosynthetic algae that are symbionts within them. And bleaching is what happened, is a event that occurs, or a condition that occurs when temperatures exceed the range that the host and the symbiote can tolerate. So when temperatures get high, corals reject their symbionts, and when they do so, they lose the color that the symbionts provide. So the reason that corals have bright colors is because they have these internal symbionts that are using pigments to conduct photosynthesis. When the temperature goes up, the zooxanthellae are excluded, and the remaining coral organism becomes white in color because it's still alive, but it's lost its symbionts. And some corals can recover if they get their symbionts back. The symbionts die, but very often a bleaching event tends to kill corals. Okay, so mutualism, they like living together. Both species derive a benefit, but they can survive apart. Symbiosis, they both receive a benefit, and that benefit is obligate. They cannot survive without that. You can also have an example of commensalism, and you can see commensalism every day on the Florida State campus, looking at the live oak trees and the ferns that grow on the branches of the live oak trees. They're deriving a benefit from the live oak, and the live oak, well, maybe it's having to carry extra weight, but it has no effect. So commensal, one species is receiving a benefit, and the other species is not suffering anything, but is not necessarily directly benefiting.
What kind of interaction is a lionfish, like invasive species, in like, for example, the Gulf of Mexico with the lionfish?
That's an example of competition. So the lionfish comes in, and it's our strategy reproducer. It reproduces very rapidly, and but unlike other fish that are native to the Gulf of Mexico, it doesn't have any predators. Okay, because the fish haven't evolved to be able to eat lionfish, and the lionfish are protected with these poisonous spines, and so predators have a hard time eating them. Places where the lionfish is native, predators have figured out ways of attacking and eating lionfish. So with the removal of the predation pressure that other fish that limits other fish, the lionfish has has a greater benefit, is able to outcompete the native fishes. So it's an example of competition, and the lionfish is winning because the native fishes can't still are being eaten by predators, but have to compete for the food sources that the lionfish would eat. So good question. Okay, so we've talked about different assemblages of species, and we can describe species communities with different terms. And so one of the terms that describes species are, well, several terms are diversity, richness, evenness, and dominance. So diversity is the number of species within a community. So these two sort of cartoons illustrate two communities with the same 10 species. And a measure of diversity is if we selected groups at random from A and B, how long would we have to sample before we got all 10 species? Think about that question a little bit. Suppose we wanted to know all the species that live in this community. Well, this community happens to be dominated by elephants. So elephants are the dominant member of this community, and numerically. So there are many, many more elephants than there are any other species. This is all kind of made up, but it illustrates this concept here. So if we didn't really know, what was happening in this environment, if we didn't know how many species were there, and we were just sampling at random, with some kind of giant net, this would work better for marine organisms because we can't actually collect with nets. We can't take, nets to sample at random from this kind of community. But, just bear with the example a little bit here. So if we were taking, samples of, say 9 species, 3 by 3, and we were taking them at random within this array, in order to get to the, to discover all 10 different species, we'd have to take many, many more samples from this community than we would from this community. Okay, so both these species have similar richness, but this community here has a greater diversity. It's not dominated. It's more evenly distributed in abundance compared to example A. All right. Any questions about that concept? Okay, so if we have a community that's dominated by elephants, in this make-believe example here, what happens if there's some disease that comes along and starts, wiping out elephants? Not anything else, just elephants. Well, if it wipes out all the elephants, or most of the elephants, this community is going to be changed very radically. And it's going to experience a lot more change than this community here. Okay, so species with that are dominated by a single species, have an inherent instability if conditions change, so that particular species is under stress. Whereas species that have an evenness in their diversity can be more stable. Okay, here's some examples of range and adaptation. And this is taken from, this is a really interesting example. This was published, this is kind of a classic paper. It was published in 1995. It's been cited by hundreds and hundreds of people. And it depends on really historic data. So this guy here is Ed Ricketts. I don't know if anybody's read John Steinbeck's Cannery Row, or Log in the Sea of Cortez, or Tortilla Flat. These are a whole series of books that John Steinbeck wrote about Monterey, California. And one of the characters in his books was a guy he called Doc, and that was based on a real person, Ed Ricketts. And Ed Ricketts lived in Monterey, and he had a business collecting specimens for laboratories. And so he would go out with a boat and collect nets and wade around in the water with a net, and he would collect specimens that he then sold to laboratories and schools and so forth. And that was how he made his living. Well, he kept very, very careful notes. He wasn't just making money, he was also a real, somebody who really, a naturalist, what we would call a naturalist. And so he kept very, very careful notes of the abundance of different species and where he caught them, how far he had to go up or down the coast. Okay, I guess I'm running over time. So the point here is that if we compare the range of organisms over time, we can see the effects of climate change. And so climate change is showing that the density is changing with respect to how far along you are. And let me skip past that. I wanted to get to one other concept, which is growth and carrying capacity. This is where this environmental resistance starts kicking in. So for any given species, it tends to increase very rapidly until it reaches some level where there's some stress that starts to affect it. Let's see. I guess I'm out of time. I'll have to stop there, and I'll put the rest of these slides online, and I'll record this. And so I'm going to end the lecture here. I guess I went a little bit over because we spent time in the beginning. This will be online, and I'll put a quiz on there. So before I go, has anybody got any questions or anything?
I do have a question. I was just thinking about the corals and their the organisms that act as a symbiotic with a symbiotic relationship to them, and you were talking about how algae and coral are in a symbiotic relationship, but what happens with like eutrophication and stuff where algae actually overcompetes these corals, but they're in a symbiotic relationship? So wouldn't you say that the more algal blooms you have, the better effect corals would prosper, but it's actually the opposite?
Okay, well, there's an important point, important distinction to make. So there are different kinds of algae, and the organisms that live in the corals are not the same as the free-living algae that form, nets and these sort of web-like features that we see when algae are blooming, or when there's, so those algae are actually, free-living, whereas the symbionts of the coral live internally inside the coelenterate, the coral organism, the one that makes the coral skeleton. And so they're different from the algae that are free living. And in fact, corals and algae are in competition. And one of the things that limits the availability of algae is that algae grow on corals, and then there are many fish and other grazing organisms that will come and graze and eat the algae. And so the existence of these other organisms grazing down the algae allows the corals to outcompete the algae. The other thing that tends to limit the growth of algae is the availability of nutrients. And so typically corals live in a low nutrient environment. So nutrient availability is also limiting the growth of algae. One of the things that happens if you eutrophy a system, you put more nutrients in there, is that the algae are able to reproduce at a greater rate, and they tend to outcompete the corals. And so that's a problem on many reefs, particularly where there's sewage outfall or other sources of nutrient eutrophication that can do that. That's also a problem in places where overfishing or other events have limited the number of grazing organisms that would keep the algae under control. Okay, so that's a good question. All right, any other questions before I leave this?
I just have a question about the attendance for these lectures.
Yes.
A certain way that you're going to do it, or?
Yeah, I get a record. That's why I had you all register. So I'll get a record of who attended. And, if you have to leave before the lecture is over or something happens, as long as you sign in at some point, I'll know that you attended. And that'll be, attendance in the lectures. Like I say, I've broadened the grade range, and what I'm looking for is everybody to keep going as best we can and get in here. So I'm not going to give you points for the attendance, but they're definitely going to help as I look at who's participating in the class and who's sticking with it. Okay.
And also, did you send us the YouTube channel that you were going to post these lectures on?
No, I'll send you a YouTube link because I have to convert this, and it takes like, actually, I'll probably take a half an hour to convert this. And the file will be like, 500 megabytes or something like that.
Right.
So that's going to take me a while to convert and upload, but I'll do it and I'll put it up there. Okay. All right. All right, I'm going to stop recording and I'll say goodbye. And you can always email me, and we'll see you again Thursday. Bye now.